Welcome everyone to episode 2 of the Alignment Gap, and today I'm thrilled to welcome Kyana Taban, a Master of Public Policy candidate at Duke University Sanford School of Public Policy and co-president of the Technology Policy Club. Kyana, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, of course. I think we're just going to go kind of straight into the questions, into kind of your biggest area of research. Do you mind just giving us a short introduction before we start and kind of what you've been working on over the last few months and years?
Sure, of course. So, like June just said, I am in my second year of my Master's of Public Policy. I'm concentrating specifically in tech policy, and tech policy definitely encompasses a lot of different topics, a lot of different areas of research. Specifically for my master's project, or kind of like my thesis, if you will, I'm working with the World Bank and trying to find certain use cases of what you might be able to call small AI or purpose-built AI for helping facilitate public service delivery in low and middle income countries. For those that are familiar with the World Bank, you know that they help finance certain initiatives in the developing world. And one of their main focus areas right now is the use of artificial intelligence in terms of improving the quality of life for people in those types of countries.
Of course, of course. So kind of going into more of a past thing, I guess, then, in terms of your own experience with education technology and how that kind of shaped your background and your perspective on your current work, it seems like you like firsthand saw how EdTech was kind of a double-edged sword in a way, how it
Yeah.
impacted people in positive ways, but negative ways. Can you speak a bit more about that?
For sure, yeah. When I first graduated from undergrad, it was during the pandemic. I graduated from UCLA in 2021. And so I had immediately, not really known what I wanted to do with my life and like where to go from there. So I decided to go into education. And so for those that are familiar, I joined Teach for America, which is an AmeriCorps program. And I was placed in an eighth grade social studies teaching position in Dallas, Texas at a charter school. And so that was my first sort of exposure to like grade school since I had finished school. And it was so different than when I was in school. I mean, I'm sure for some of the younger audience here, they're totally used to having like a Chromebook in school and like everything being online on digital platforms. I was kind of on the cusp of that. That was sort of starting to become popular when I was like in high school, so I didn't really get a ton of it when I was younger. When I was like in, let's say 11th or 10th grade and younger, everything was on paper. It wasn't very digitized. And so as I was trying to, me myself as an educator, learn how to use these different platforms and tools, it was interesting to me that in some ways it was really helpful in terms of like tracking trends across like different students, your entire class periods versus each other, different teachers, to be able to see the trends and for example the math scores or whatever, right? So as a teacher, those tools can be really useful in terms of tracking, right? And in terms of like building lesson plans, trying to like sort of copy the same lesson plan over again. Like it could be really useful for all of those types of things. Of course, like grades, like we're used to seeing grades on Canvas and assignments and stuff like that. Although I think younger grades would probably use more like a Google Classroom as opposed to Canvas. But what was striking to me was as much as it's a useful tool for educators, and in some ways, of course, it is really useful for students as well, the overexposure to technology, I think, also has a detrimental impact on young developing brains. And that's not just like the type of ed tech that like a teacher or like a classroom would use. Of course, when I'm saying exposure to technology, I'm also stating the obvious when I mean like social media or like the use of generative AI in their classwork, in their like homework assignments. And so that's kind of ridding children developing brains, right? The opportunity to struggle, right? When there's a way to get an answer to, let's say, an algebra problem, right? That's kind of like eighth or ninth grade math, right? Or like a way to sort of get like what's something that we read when we're younger, probably like Huckleberry Finn or something like To Kill a Mockingbird. Instead of like struggling through that and building those neurons and like trying to learn, right? If you resort to something like ChatGPT or Claude to be able to get the answer easily, it's not helpful. And it's really jarring to me because when I was in the classroom, those tools were like just barely a thing. I don't think most kids understood it, right? But now I can't even imagine. It's been about 4 or 5 years since I've left the classroom. A lot of my friends are still teachers, and they're really seeing some struggling with their students grasping concepts, being able to think critically, and sort of maybe a level of maturity, I think, in the classroom socially, which is also really important. As an educator, you're also there to develop them socially. So it's a lot of issues. Generative or like generally, sorry, technology can be really, really useful. I'm not saying it's not, but there is a double-edged sword, like you said.
Yeah, for sure. I remember even when I was in high school, GPT 3.5 had come out, and even that was just like nothing compared to now. It would get like most of the questions wrong. So, students in my class would end up not using it because it just like led us astray. But
Right.
now it's almost like fully accurate for all like grade level teaching and grade level assignments. So it's definitely something that has been kind of on an exponential rise. In terms of development socially per se, like what do you think about kind of the personalization of technology and this kind of dependence on technology causes kids to kind of be maybe more stunted socially or have more difficulty in that realm?
Well, if we're going to take the specific example of like, for example, ChatGPT or any sort of like these like chatbot like LLMs, they're made to be sycophantic, right? Which means like they're giving you an answer that you want to hear because they want you to keep using it, right? So when a kid, or for example, like a teenager or whatever, which you're, hormonal, you're insecure. I mean, I'm not trying to generalize every child on planet Earth, but like that's a general trend of like young people, right?
Yeah.
And you use these chatbots, for example, like socially as a friend or like a place to get advice. It can definitely lead to a lot of problems. I mean, I'm sure a few months ago, a lot of people were aware of the really tragic suicide of Adam Rain, right? In which he was resorting to ChatGPT as like a sort of like emotional outlet. And not to say that he was stunted, but of course, if you had instead gone to a real person, like a school counselor, some other trusted adult, they would have been able to intervene. But when you're telling the chatbot, I think all my friends secretly hate me, and you're sort of giving it like a prompt, so to speak, it's going to respond like, that's entirely possible. And here's why I think so, And so, like, there isn't a real person there to sort of bring you back down to earth and say, whoa, that's crazy. I think we need to take a step back. Or, like, here's actually what I think you should do instead, which is like more healthy. And so that was a teenager, right? Who actually probably had most of his social development prior to these chatbots being released. I can only imagine what children who, you can go buy toys that have like AI built inside of them. And you talk to the stuffed animal, it talks back to you and stuff like that. So I can only imagine what like a 5 or 6 year old who is already kind of having this integrated into their social sphere, that would look like for them when they're reaching college age.
Right, right. I think a lot of the issue comes with this double-edged sword of personalization, in that
Mhm.
you can, kind of submit personalized questions. You can ask personalized
Yeah.
insights from the AI, and that's great, when you have to do a specific assignment. But that also means that everything that the AI is giving you is perfectly personalized to your personality and to
Mhm.
your interests and everything along those lines, which, has long-term consequences on how you develop even what you would call a relationship with the AI. You see that a lot with specifically with like generative companies like character AI, for example, as compared to Claude or these other frontier AI models. So I think that's definitely an issue that we're seeing. I think I kind of want to veer more to your project with the World Bank, and
Right.
that's incredibly interesting. For you particularly, you mentioned earlier, what specific kind of citizen-facing services are you personally focusing on, and how did you identify the populations, for example, or how did you identify the specific technologies that would benefit most from these AI interventions?
Yes, that's like actually part of my ongoing research, right? So the World Bank basically gave me a certain list of like me and my teammates, I happen to be in a group, gave us a certain list of like characteristics or like parameters that they wanted to see included in the report. And that included a sort of hopeful emphasis on a few like World Bank priority sectors, which were healthcare, agriculture, education, tourism, and manufacturing. Now, that wasn't like an exhaustive list and it wasn't like a prescriptive list either. Like it was just maybe hopefully it could touch on these areas.
Right.
As I've been conducting interviews and going into like some like white and gray literature in terms of like the types of public facing service delivery areas that would be like most helpful. Honestly, it could be as simple as just like filling out government paperwork. Something as simple as like opening a bank account or applying for an ID or like a small business loan. All of these areas, which are just like typical day-to-day things, but in some developing nations could really be like facilitated with the use of like, for example, a purpose-built AI model. They exist. In terms of like certain populations or like areas that would benefit the most, we're trying to target Africa in general. It seems like there are some countries that have like really good infrastructure and like really good sort of like already like a culture in place of being like a good sort of ecosystem to have these types of like AI startups, for example, or AI integration. And that seems to be largely like Nigeria and Rwanda, but we're not just sticking to those countries. There's been a lot of headway in like Morocco as well. Um, Countries like Western countries like the US, Europe, etc., they've already made inroads in these areas, so they don't necessarily need to have as much like targeted research towards them. India already has like really robust like, digital public infrastructure, and there's already like inroads to integrate AI there as well. But largely, we're trying to focus on Africa. And there is like definitely like case studies for South America as well, but again, they already kind of have that going for them. So largely we're focusing on sub-Saharan Africa, but like for example, Morocco also has some really great things happening for them as well.
That's great. I think the biggest question that most people would have surrounding a project like this is kind of how do you make AI in this sense useful enough, but also accessible enough to the local populations that actually need it, right? And kind of balancing that. How do you consider that trade-off in your head?
So there definitely is a trade-off, right? Like you said, frontier AI like ChatGPT or Claude or Perplexity or whatever, right? They're fantastic. They're super, super advanced. They have like 3 trillion like, parameters around them, so they give you these highly accurate answers, but they're so expensive and they're so heavily dependent on electricity and water and these big, big data centers that take up like huge like plots of land and they're very expensive to build, as we know all of this, right? The other issue is that those types of frontier AI are trained on English and not just English, almost the entirety of the internet, right? They're trained on like Reddit or like Twitter posts and stuff like that, which is great for Western users, right? But for a small farmer in Nigeria, that's not going to be entirely useful. Not only it's not accessible, it just wouldn't do what he needs it to do, right? If
Mhm.
you're a crop farmer in sub-Saharan Africa and you want to figure out why your like couscous or I don't actually know exact crops that grow there, but for example, right, why your like yams have like a certain disease and they're not growing as well. You don't need an AI model that's trained on the entirety of Am I the asshole on Reddit? You know what I mean? What you need is something that's purpose built and small and perhaps trained on a local language, right? So they're going to be smaller, right? They're not going to be as advanced. Maybe they're like somewhat limited, right? But that's actually a benefit. The trade-off also, of course, is that they're going to have to be built on, they're not going to need nearly as much like, physical like equipment like compute and stuff like that. Theoretically, they should be able to be run on like a personal laptop, right? But the trade-off there is, of course, like speed and like the sort of breadth of what it can cover. Again, that's both a good and a bad thing, right? It's good because if it's purpose-built and this exact sort of like type of technology is just made for people in Rwanda to make their health insurance appointments, that's all you need it to be trained on.
Right.
So, yeah.
I guess that's kind of the thing that is kind of aligned with the goals of the entire like AI alignment space and AI risk space in general, and that purpose-built AI is actually better not just for serving the specific purposes, but for mitigating risk long term, like existential risk from AGI, all this like race to the bottom stuff with all these frontier AI companies that come along with trying to capture as much breadth instead of like the depth of specific industries or specific verticals. I think that's a key thing. I mean, you've already seen that every time ChatGPT and OpenAI want to create a new model, it has to take more and more data from more and more random and unfiltered places. Even when they got all of GitHub back in the day when they were making 3.5, that still wasn't enough. They had to scrape all of Reddit, et cetera, et cetera. And I guess these just aren't useful in terms of what the majority of the world, like at least the global South needs in terms of their specific applications for AI. Um,
Mhm.
and so for you personally, why do you think it's more important as of like how realistic do you think it is for, certain companies or certain, organizations to start creating these more narrow forms of AI for, more underserved and more marginalized populations? Is that kind of something realistic in the future, or is that kind of far away and unlikely?
I'm not sure if I'm like the authority to make a decision on that. I don't pretend to understand, the corporate decisions
Yeah.
at, for example, OpenAI or Anthropic or whatnot. I would imagine there's not that much money there for them to go make a small purpose-built, like narrow, fine-tuned type of like maybe a small language model or like a smaller AI for some, for example, small manufacturing in, I don't know, Chile, for example. I don't know if there's money for them in that. And if there's not money, I don't know if they do it. That being said, I think like a lot of these the room for like this type of technology, even if it's more small, even if it's more narrow, even if it's not as powerful, there is demand for it. I
Mhm.
do think like in my research thus far, I've seen that a lot of these, like for example, startups partner with the government sometimes, and sometimes they partner with like local consulting firms. So there are like areas for like public-private partnerships.
Yeah.
I don't necessarily know if that would include like the bigger AI companies as we know it, but I could be wrong, right? I'm not Fuqua, I'm not a business person, so I wouldn't exactly know, but there might be an area for opportunity there.
Yeah, for sure. I think just kind of what we're seeing generally outside the United States is a veering towards, smaller companies having those direct partnerships with government as compared to
Mhm.
these huge, massive frontier AI companies. Because, I think the trend we've seen is that, OpenAI, Anthropic, Grok, etc., all these companies are kind of racing towards AGI and kind of getting the biggest, baddest type of AI possible. Countries like
Exactly.
China specifically are kind of more focus on deployment of AI technology. You've already seen that across like a bunch of different industries and sectors within China itself. And I think that's kind of what it's more focusing on. They're hinging their bets more on, AGI probably won't happen. And in that case, it's more useful to use our limited number of chips that the US is allowing us to have in order to kind of deploy in more local areas, which honestly may be the smarter play kind of with the unlikely nature of AI AGI particularly that we've seen pop up over the last few years. I guess two questions about kind of the risks of serving these marginalized communities and these underserved communities with AI specifically then. The first question I have is how do you kind of measure whether these AI solutions are really empowering communities or creating kind of dependencies on this technology per se?
That's such an excellent question, and it's so timely and funny that you asked me that because just before I hopped on this interview, like literally an hour before, I had an interview with a professor here at Duke asking her the same thing. It was Professor Brene Bent, if you are familiar with her. I was asking her the exact same thing. Like, how do I know for my own, like, World Bank like thesis project, how do I know if AI is being leveraged successfully by a government?
Right.
And that's the issue. I mean, like, I'm citing her own answer, right? That she said, well, that is an issue that you don't really know what the ROI is on, for example, AI because they haven't designed like really accurate or efficient evaluation models for it yet. So the answer to your question is I don't know because the people above me don't know yet either.
Do you potentially see a world though where someone could create, there could be like in the same way that, middle schoolers and individuals in education are kind of dependent on this AI, for example, this could
Mhm.
create over dependencies even with like narrow applications of AI. Do you think that similar thing could potentially happen?
I'm sure it absolutely could, right? The same way that I'm dependent on my iPhone. I mean, if you were to take it away from me, not only I wouldn't know how to get to like a new a different grocery store. I wouldn't know how to drive there, right? I wouldn't know how to like sign into the Duke gym because my ID is on my phone, right? I wouldn't know how to do anything, right? Yeah, absolutely. People become dependent on technology the same way I'm dependent on my car to get places and I'm dependent on my computer to do work. I think it's inevitable. Do I think every single person is going to be dependent on every type of AI? Absolutely not. But like, yeah, yeah, a farmer is dependent on tractors. They weren't 200 years ago, but it is what it is. I actually don't know when a tractor was invented, but for example.
I think around like 150
Okay, yeah.
maybe.
So we'll go with 200.
Fair enough. I think, yeah, I think the key thing with that is that even when new technologies do pop up, there's a huge, huge tendency to kind of be dependent on them. And then the question kind of becomes, how do we ensure that access remains stable and that the
Yeah.
individuals kind of, creating that access in the first place are good actors and not ones that, can maliciously like cut access or, do random things towards those individuals because of this dependency. And I think, an easy example already is like social media in terms of how kind of they've, I wouldn't say weaponized, but used or utilized, people's attention and engagement on these platforms to do what they want in terms of getting as much ad revenue, blah, 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 as possible. And so my question to you is, how would you suggest, just off the top of your head, how would you suggest we kind of ensure that the access is of like kind of quality access and that like they're kind of good actors being put in these positions to control this technology rather than, more malicious ones?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel like maybe as an American, I could probably draw a comparison to healthcare, right? So a lot of countries like in Scandinavia, Germany, just pretty much anywhere, right? Healthcare is, or Canada, right, is government provided and there's like universal access to healthcare. Is it always going to be the most timely, the most high quality? Not necessarily. There's definitely problems with that as well, but there is like, guaranteed access through the government, right? And so maybe then the answer is instead of having like a sort of profit-driven model in which like all AI is provided by private companies and therefore their first and foremost priority is going to be generating shareholder value, right? So maybe nationalizing it, publicly making it available, right, as like a public good, the same way that a lot of countries do with healthcare or access to roads or public education, right? That might be the answer.
Right. And I think, that's a very difficult thing to do. But honestly, I think it's kind of easier in a sense to do that for more narrow applications of AI than it is for obviously more generative big ones because, the vested interest of kind of these larger companies like OpenAI, like Anthropic, etc., is to create the biggest, baddest model possible, something that
Mhm.
smaller companies that may be partnering with the government, for example, or maybe even the like branch of the government is creating this, AI technology for certain industries. I guess it's more feasible in a sense for smaller companies or, companies directly working with the government to kind of apply and deploy those technologies. So it may
Yeah,
actually be easier in a sense. And like healthcare, that hopefully will be the reality for the global
fingers
south,
crossed.
the rest of the world. Fingers crossed. I think we can just see based off how the US runs its healthcare that it may not be in our best interest to have only big companies kind of develop this type of technology. A question I want to ask, kind of not so much of a risk, but in terms of working across like different cultural and economic contexts, how do we kind of ensure that we make AI responsible to and kind of pertinent to the local context rather than kind of like a Western, developed definition or a Western imposed definition of it?
Well, I think the answer to that is just making sure that if if there's a certain type of AI model that is meant to serve a certain community, a certain country, for example, then it should be built by those people, if and when possible, right? Making sure, that you have those people in the room when decisions are being made. Additionally, when you think about it, AI has to be trained on a certain set of data, right? And so what is like, the morals or the ethics or the cultural context of that data? Who makes that decision of what's chosen, right? I'm in actually a class, I think it's called the moral philosophy of AI.
Mhm.
So it is actually a philosophy course, but it's about AI, and that's literally what our first day of class was on. How do you decide like if an AI model is ethical? Well, whose ethics was it trained on? How do you decide if it's like politically correct? what is politically correct in the current like content, you know what I mean? Context. So I don't know who gets to make those decisions. That's a question that's like higher up above me. But you have to make sure that it's trained on data that you want to be reflected in their answers. And hopefully the people in the room are of the sort of culture or background of the people that you want it to serve.
Right. And I think the most important thing with that is just kind of having people, letting those people have a seat at the table, basically, and kind of inform those decisions because you can't make accurate decisions when you don't have, the very people that you're trying to serve there. And I think this was a big conversation I had with Professor Sinat Armstrong as well. And
He
we
is the
were,
professor of the class I just spoke of.
oh,
Yes.
yeah, he's
I have his
fantastic.
book right here.
Yeah. It's a great book.
Yeah.
But he just talked about like how do you ensure that something is ethical or moral,
Yes.
quote unquote, right? Like how do you actually ensure that it's within the definition of what you promise it to be? And how do you even decide that kind of definition in the first place? Whose rendition of that definition do you even use, etc. And what he kind of expressed was that even if there are a bunch of different culturally or socioeconomically different interpretations of what is moral or what is just or all of these different values, humanity has a lot more in common than it does kind of disparate from each other. And so we kind of focus on these like basic human values of like, oh, like we probably want to like be kind, we probably want to have empathy, we probably want to care about others, that type of thing. And I guess that is a decent framework. And then I guess beyond that, it's just adjusting to kind of the cultural and economic context of certain areas, especially of the global South. Um, I think the last question I kind of have about this whole World Bank project is kind of what role should international organizations like the World Bank, as they have already done, kind of play in terms of this AI research and AI deployment and intervention compared to, for example, local governments? Do you think there should be a lot of cross collaboration between the two? Kind of how do you think that should play out?
I actually think there should be because the benefit of having like a sort of multilateral, like these big international organizations like the World Bank or, even like the UN and stuff like that is that they do have connections everywhere. That's their thing. They know different organizations, different people, different leaders across all different sectors, all different lines of work, all across the world. So it's really good to have that as a sort of like connecting like overhead body, right? But their role, I think, is that it's connecting, it's providing research, it's doing, having data to pick off from. But the actual sort of work itself, I think, should be done by those local organizations and the local governments, right? The World Bank is great in the sense that they're able to some extent, like finance these things, right? It's the bank, right? So these smaller global South countries, they might not have like the capacity, the finances, the whatever, the resources to make some of these big ideas happen. And so to the extent possible, I do think it's good that the World Bank is able to be there for that reason, to be able to be like a convening body for different leaders to meet in this space. And to connect to like their partner organizations, the World Bank, for example, will partner with like the UN or the Gates Foundation, just like other philanthropic bodies. And that's how they get their work done by just connecting people, connecting places, connecting money, money matters.
It does matter. I mean, this type of research can't be done. A lot of the deployments can't be done. A lot of the funding for these programs are often done through these big, like, multilateral organizations. So I think that's definitely an important thing to keep in mind. I know you've also done some work, being like a speaker and representing women in a kind of this like technology space. Can you speak just some more about that and how those experiences have impacted you?
For sure, yeah. I think you mentioned early in my introduction that I'm the co-president of the Tech Policy Club, which I am this year. But last year I was in the position called Femtech Lead, so like feminist technology lead. And that was kind of like my I don't want to call it a hazing ritual, but it was like my sort of like grunt work before you can get up to being like president or co-president's level, was I did the annual Duke Women in Technology, Women in Tech Policy, I think, conference, which we hosted at Duke for the first time last year in May, or sorry, excuse me, March. And that was fantastic. That was the first time that I was able to sort of have like an A to Z conference and it was entirely in my vision and I was the lead on that. And that was like so fulfilling for me. It was a lot of work for sure, but it was fantastic to be able to sort of pick the topics that I wanted to see and find the people to do the speaking. And the whole event was like my vision. And so, I was really excited to find like female leaders in the space. For our keynote speaker, it was Tara McGinnis, who is one of the executive directors at New America, which is like a think tank in DC. And so she was able to speak on public interest technology. As you can see, that's kind of an area that I'm interested in. But I also had two panels. One of them was on digital inclusion, and that included on the panel three women that are in like digital inclusion or digital accessibility at the city of Durham, the state of North Carolina, and another who did the same kind of work at the university level across different universities in North Carolina. And so that was really amazing to have those three like women that are super like experienced in these fields. One of them was also a Duke Sanford MPP alum to be able to sit on the panel together and talk about like this passion of theirs. But I think the panel that I was the most excited for and passionate about was a sort of like you taking a look at the use of technology in facilitating gender-based violence. And so that panel had Professor Jolyn Dellinger and Professor Pardis Naini Imami, which are two both super powerful, incredible women at Duke. One of them, Professor Dellinger, is a law professor, and Professor Naini is at the Pratt School. And so they were able to speak from both like a sort of legal perspective and like a bit more of a technical understanding of, for example, like deepfake pornography or the use of like trackers that like facilitate like spousal abuse and stuff like that. And so like those like areas of feminism are really important to me. And I had such a great time last semester, fall, semester. I took two classes with Professor Dellinger. One of them was called Privacy, Ethics, and Technology. And in that class, I had like such a great time because I wrote this, for me, a really fascinating paper on the use of how what one might say like internet enabled like sexual devices and how like that those companies sell your data. And so like largely like the people who would use those types of devices tend to be women, right? But not always. And then also in her other class, which was the Privacy in a Post-Dobbs World. That was a law school class, and that was about the sort of surveillance of women post the Dobbs decision, meaning like as certain states like reduce their access to abortion and make it more and more criminalized, that there is now like a sort of surveillance economy on women who are pregnant or just people who are pregnant and maybe are interested in like no longer being pregnant, right? So their location being tracked, their search history being tracked, and all of that. So this is an area of technology that I'm interested in and an area of feminism that I'm interested in. And for me, it's really fulfilling to work in research in those spaces. And I hope I can maybe take that to my career going forward.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's also a huge consideration when we consider, deployments of artificial intelligence and more advanced technologies into the global south, as well as how do we kind of ensure that those technologies get used responsibly, per se, and not, in the ways that, all the ways that you just described. I mean, I know OpenAI for the first, however many years had huge, huge issues every time they released a model with all of these, deepfake pornography, people using it for malicious reasons. We saw Grok just had a scandal just like a week ago because of all of that, and like Elon Musk is getting sued now. I mean, all of this stuff is so unprecedented. And what are your kind of thoughts on a lot of people who say that kind of the regulations are moving too slow in response to AI, and kind of the exponential increases in, model deployments and all of these things of artificial intelligence? Do you think there needs to be kind of, more scrutiny over AI in the current day, especially from a feminist lens as well?
I would say so for sure. I mean, like we said earlier, these big AI companies, their first and foremost, priority is money and then also being on top, right? And so that creates a sort of atmosphere in which the priority is to like release, 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 not necessarily test, 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 and like let's double check and all of that, right? And
Right.
so from like a feminist perspective, it's so heartbreaking when you realize a lot of this AI leads to sort of like these crazy like unethical products like undressing apps, right? In which, teenage boys wants to see what their classmates look like without clothes. And of course, like that's like a natural sort of like human curiosity, but it shouldn't be done to like unconsenting like underage girls, you know what I mean? And that's terrible. Or the fact that like they're also used as a way to sort of discredit women in the public eye, like female politicians. Like how much does AOC have to go through for crying out loud, right? And all of that does is like reinforce that these products are often built by men for men, right? And so the result is that they're not really as tested as they should be, and they don't have as strict regulations as they probably should, because there shouldn't be a product that exists that you could do that to somebody else, because even if it's comes out that that was like a fake image, right? It was not real, and this person didn't actually take their clothes off or didn't say this thing that it's this deep fake is projecting that they have, right? The damage is done. You know what I mean? Your reputation is ruined, your self-esteem has been hit, you have anxiety, right? Like, and that carries with you. I can only imagine, what that might do to a girl who's like 12 or 13, and and that type of fear that you carry with you going forward as you get older. So yeah, I do think that there should be more. I don't know how, but like there should be more.
For sure. And like, how do you kind of see that coinciding with the dependence on AI in grade school and for younger students as well? Like, how do you see that kind of culture of, deep fakes and all of these like malicious things that are now possible thanks to AI
Mhm.
kind of being used by students who have more dependency and kind of had more exposure to AI from a young age?
Yeah, I mean, I think it normalizes it, right? I mean, when I was like in middle school, the sort of like cool technology and whatever that I would go spend my time on is was like FrostWire or LimeWire. I was trying to like pirate music onto my hot pink iPod, and that was like what was happening for me, right? And I felt kind of bad doing it because you're not supposed to. And so, but now it's like, that's not really a thing anymore. Like spending hours on Tumblr, people, I don't even think Tumblr exists, right? So like this is like the kind of like entertainment maybe, or like pastime that a lot of young people use, is playing around on AI, not only in the sense that like they do it outside of like their general like class time, but they're also using like other like like ChatGPT, for example, for their classwork too. So AI is integrated to like every aspect of their life. It feels normal, you know what I mean? I think like there is definitely like a responsibility and like what is the word I'm looking for, accountability to be had for children or just people in general who are using AI in bad faith to like, and it can, create some kind of harm done onto others. But in terms of like, kind of children doing it, I think they don't necessarily even always understand like the kind of harm that they're doing to themselves and to others, right? And so when you explain to them like, hey, you can't use this like, tool to do this thing, that's so bad, you're harming somebody else, maybe hopefully then they understand, right? And know that there are like consequences to their actions. But when they're raised on using these things, I don't think always that thought occurs to them to begin with. So that's scary, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and I guess the big thing there is just, information, right? Like adults and most importantly kids can't do anything when they don't know that what they're doing is wrong in a sense. And so
Mhm.
I guess even like AI safety and AI, like responsibility has to kind of be built into our education systems in a sense. Or, these kids will be going through all 12 years of grade school just unknowing of, what type of risks that AI presents to them.
Mhm.
What are your thoughts on having those type of programs kind of integrated into, education within within current education systems?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great idea. I mean, like thinking back to when I was younger, and I might be dating myself just a touch. When I was in elementary school, not everybody had like a personal laptop back then. It was kind of like you had like the family computer in a family room, right? And so the way that like we would learn how to type is that we would go to the computer lab, and that was like something that we did like once or twice a week, and then we'd practice typing, and that was a skill that was really important for young people to learn. I don't think that happens anymore because now kids just kind of have a laptop, I mean, they're given the Chromebook at school if nothing else. And so there's definitely still room, I think, in like a week's worth of school to have like a once a week sort of like tech literacy class or like an AI literacy class. The same way that like, when we're younger, we learn that like Wikipedia is a tool, but you shouldn't necessarily rely on every single thing it says. And, it can be written by anyone, not necessarily an expert. So, you can use it as like a jumping start to like, different research, but don't rely on it entirely. I think the same could be said for AI. A lot of professors that I'm seeing now, like in my own education at Duke, in their syllabi, they have like some sort of an AI clause, right? And a lot of them, most of them actually say like, hey, I know that you're going to use AI. Use it correctly, use it effectively, use it as a tool, not as a crutch, right? So I think if we're kind of instilling that in like younger people's education, it could be a lot better. The same way that like, um 18 years ago or so, I learned how to type in a computer lab playing like different games and stuff. I hope maybe there are like, already like sort of programs geared towards children to teach them to use AI as a tool.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, that's not only important in within like schools in America, but all across the world. And hopefully that can continue to go at a faster rate than, for example, technology literacy and like computer literacy was just given in the global south, for example. Hopefully AI can catch up quicker to that kind of rate because AI has a lot more potential to be, a lot more devastating in a sense, in a lot of ways than does just normal computers and normal Chromebooks that students use at school. So yeah,
Mhm.
that's definitely a huge, huge issue that we need to focus on. But yeah, those were all my questions for today. Thank you so much for being here with me.
Thank you for having me. This is super fun.
Of course, thank you so much.
All right, wonderful. Have a great rest of your